Alô. Alô. Ok? Todo mundo ouve no final? No fundo? Boa tarde, pessoal. Nós queríamos começar dando as boas-vindas a todo mundo e dizendo que é motivo de grande satisfação estar recebendo vocês aqui. Ainda não é a abertura oficial do evento, né? Mas a gente queria dizer que está muito feliz de estar fazendo, pela primeira vez, eu coloco o internacional de forma presencial desde 2019, né? E principalmente a primeira vez depois da tragédia dos anos de governo Bolsonaro, né? Ter, pelo menos do ponto de vista do governo, ter se encerrado, né? Mas também fazemos a abertura desse evento na data em que lembramos dos 50 anos do golpe militar que derrubou o governo Allende no Chile e instalou a sanguinária ditadura de Pinochet, né? Algo que deve nos manter sempre alerta, né, para as ameaças que pairam sobre nós na América Latina e não só, né, no mundo hoje. Bom, mas nós estamos também muito felizes porque tivemos a sorte de poder contar aqui, né, para esse mini-curso com o professor Kevin Anderson, né? Kevin Anderson é distinguished professor no Departamento de Sociologia da Universidade da Califórnia, em Santa Bárbara, onde ele também leciona para os departamentos de Ciência Política, Estudos Feministas e Estudos Globais. Ele está nessa universidade desde 2009. Antes ele nasceu, viveu, foi criado, né, na região metropolitana de Nova York, Nova Jersey, onde ele se tornou também um ativista, né, dos movimentos, como ele define, dos movimentos por justiça social. Em 1983, ele recebeu o seu título de doutorado, PhD, como eles chamam lá, em Sociologia, na City University of Nova York, e ele, nos anos 80, desculpa, ele passou a viver na região de Chicago, né? Lá ele lecionou nas universidades de Northern Illinois e Purdue University. Acho que todos aqui, todos conhecem, né, o livro dele, Marx, Nas Margens, que foi traduzido para o português e publicado no Brasil em 2019, mas ele também já escreveu muitas outras obras, entre elas Lenin, Hegel e o Marxismo Ocidental, que foi publicado em 1995, e com a companheira dele, Janet Ferry, ele publicou em 2005 Foucault e a Revolução Iraniana, Gênero e as Seduções do Islamismo. Mais recentemente, em 2020, saiu uma edição de vários textos publicados em diferentes momentos da vida dele, né, chamado Dialética da Evolução, Hegel, Marxismo e seus críticos pelas lentes de raça, classe, gênero e colonialismo. Ele tem também vários trabalhos como editor de obras de Marx, de Rosa Luxemburgo e, especialmente, de Raya Dunayevskaya, né, que foi uma inspiração e uma referência, né, para o próprio trabalho dele, Kevin. Recentemente, ele recebeu o reconhecimento pela trajetória acadêmica dos prêmios da seção marxista da Associação de Sociologia dos Estados Unidos, assim como da seção de História da Sociologia e do Pensamento Social da mesma associação. O Kevin nunca deixou a militância política e social, e ele é um dos principais organizadores da International Marxist Humanist Organization. Ele trouxe um material em português para vocês conhecerem um pouco da organização, e também eu vou passar uma lista para quem quiser receber a newsletter deles por e-mail, né? Eles enviam. Atualmente, ele está preparando um livro novo sobre a concepção de revolução e outros temas nos últimos escritos do Marx. É sobre isso que ele vai tratar aqui hoje. É uma espécie de segundo volume, de continuação do debate que ele faz no Marx nas Margens. Mas agora vamos ouvi-lo, que é muito mais interessante do que eu dizer o que ele vai tratar aqui, ele mesmo vai apresentar para vocês. Bom, sejam todas e todos novamente bem-vindos, né? E vamos passar a palavra ao professor Kevin Mattos.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. Is that a good spot for the microphone? I'm very happy to be here. This is my second trip to Brazil, my second trip to this university. And the last time I was here, I spoke on the book Marx at the Margins. But I don't want to repeat the same talk, so I'm talking about related topic. It's kind of in a way the second volume of Marx at the Margins, as Marcelo was saying. And so it's actually very similar, though, in a lot of the themes. I also want to say, I want to recognize September 11th, 1973, 50 years ago, one of the worst events of modern history. And I want to say, as a young man, I'm old enough that I was young then, but old enough to know what was happening. So I was actually at the demonstration at the United Nations. We had 1,000 people. We were demonstrated for a whole week. And different people came and addressed us. Like Angela Davis came, for example, gave a speech. So it's something that has to be remembered, and not just as memory, but memories for the future, because Brazil and the United States have a lot of things in common, including racial and slavery-based capitalism. But another thing we have in common is that we each experienced attempted coups. This kind of thing of 1973 is not only in history, it's happening right in front of us. So it's important to memorialize this for the lessons for today. Okay, if you could please go to the next slide. In his last years, which I'm identifying as 1869 to 1883, but it's really 1882 because he doesn't write anything. He dies in March 1882. He can't write anything anymore. The last writing we have is, I think, November 1882. But in his last years, Marx sketches several types of revolutionary change, and each of them are somewhat different from the united working class uprising that forms the conclusion to his major work, Capital, Volume 1. As we know, in Capital, Marx writes of a working class revolution, and he writes at a very high level of abstraction. In the English edition, it's chapter 31, the second to the last chapter of the book, the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation, and he describes a working class revolution in an advanced industrial society. He doesn't say Britain, but it's probably basing on Britain. So here's what he says. Along with a constant decrease in the number of capitalist magnates who usurp and monopolize all the advantages of this process of transformation, the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, and exploitation grows. But with this, there also grows the revolt of the working class, a class constantly increasing in numbers and trained, united, and organized by the very mechanism of the capitalist process of production. So we have here two things: the famous development of the productive forces that Marx writes about his whole life, something unique to capitalism. Already in the Communist Manifesto, he said, capitalism developed more productive forces than all previous modes of production in a rapid period. And this dialectically calls into being an oppositional class, the working class, that because it's urbanized and for other reasons, it's a much more united type of oppressed class than, say, the peasantry or the urban artisans, even of the European Middle Age. So the united working class and its aspirations becomes incompatible with the capitalist integument, the kind of membrane. And so what follows is the death knell of capitalist property, and I put the word private in brackets because he actually removes that later on. And whereas he says the expropriators are expropriated, those who expropriated the land and instruments of production of the working class made them into wage laborers. Those people are in turn expropriated. It's kind of a revenge of history by the descendants of those workers. And the workers established a democratic communist system, and he actually has a footnote to the Communist Manifesto. He also writes, without mentioning his mentor Hegel, he says this is the negation of the negation. But since he's writing in German, he doesn't have to mention it, because any German reader would know, and even today any Marxist would know, that that's connected to dialectic. Okay, so the next slide, please. So this is a rigorously dialectical, but very abstract model. And this is one of the reasons why some people prefer and don't prefer the Grundrisse to Capital, because the Grundrisse is an unfinished manuscript, whereas Capital has this very tight ending, and then everything kind of leads up to that point. And there's Marxists like Moshe Pastone who said he really should have ended it earlier, because people think it's too, that maybe it won't lead to revolution, for example. But when I say it's an abstract model, what I mean is he's looking at capitalism at a very general level, at a very high level of development. He's looking at industrial capitalism here. He's not looking at what's happening in the colonies or the dependencies. And very specifically, he doesn't mention race, because the working class is not monolithic. He doesn't mention colonialism, because it's not just British capitalism in Britain. He doesn't mention gender, that the worker class is of both men and women. He doesn't mention the state. It's really odd in the discussion of revolution not to say anything about the state, because the state would obviously be an obstacle. And many other concrete factors he could have mentioned. Now he discusses these more concrete factors throughout his writings, but especially in his late writings of these last 13 years of his life. I think he has some very interesting things to say. So I want to focus on today on three of these sets of writings. One on race, class, nationalism, and revolution in Ireland and Europe, but the framework he's using is partially carried over from his writings on race and class in the United States and the Civil War. And I'm so happy to see that those writings are finally translated into Portuguese with an introduction by Marcelo, because these are important not just in the United States, but really globally as we now look at the relationship of race and class. Two, explicitly anti-state conceptions of communism in the Paris Commune, in his writings on the Paris Commune, and in his critique of the Gotha program, both written in the middle of the 1870s. And then finally, number three, the pre-capitalist village commune as a base of resistance to capital and for communism, especially in Russia, but many other agrarian societies outside Western Europe. In each of these three cases, Marx revises his earlier views and explicitly says he's changing in the first two examples, but I think the implicit change is pretty obvious in the third example too. So the next slide. So first I want to look at Ireland. So here it's, well, it's not only Ireland, but it's the Irish immigrant proletariat inside of England as well. The specificity of ethnicity, nationalism, colonialism, and class in the context of the wider European revolution. He's talking about a European or even maybe wider going over to North America revolution. So Marx takes this up in Capital Volume 1, in the chapter 25 on the general law of capital, of the accumulation of capital. He sees Ireland as a victim of particularly capitalist form of colonialism with very bitter class conflicts between British landlords and Irish peasants, which threatened to weaken Britain as a world power. And some of this writing is considered to be a predecessor of what became dependency. Ireland is a dependent capitalism. But to Marx, there were two colonial situations that he actually wrote a lot about from the earliest days and where he was very supportive of anti-colonial resistance. One was Ireland, the other was Poland, and this is really for his whole generation of European socialists. The one is being colonized by advanced capitalist Britain, and the other by a reactionary power, agrarian Russia, whose social formation is actually in some ways even more conservative than that in Poland at the time. And it's very interesting because Marx spends a lot of, he writes hundreds of pages, thousands even, about Russian Tsarism. If you said the Russians, the Tsar in Marx's day, it's kind of like saying the CIA today. Like they had police, they were everywhere. There's Joseph Conrad's famous novel of the revolutionary, the terrorist conspiracy, and the Russians are like manipulating this in order to discredit the revolutionary movement. So this is Marx's generation, and Marx's whole generation supported Poland. In 1848, when the workers marched down the streets of Paris, they would chant "Abat la bourgeoisie," down with the bourgeoisie, and they would chant "Viva la Polonia," long live Poland. Because this was a really important cause. And when I wrote Marx at the margins, these writings seemed a little bit dated. I mean, I did want to write the chapter, but it seemed more for historical purposes. But if you look at the world today, we see that the regime in Russia actually is making, obviously, a very different mode of production than the Tsarist regime, but the ideological claims are remarkably similar. This fusion of Slavophilism, you know, that Russia is somehow a unique civilization and needs to go back to its pre-modern roots, interconnected with the Russian Orthodox Church, which had the division with the Western Roman Church, and you can see this ideology in motion in their justifications of the war in Ukraine. So I do recommend, if you're interested in that, it's not a topic of today's talk, but if you're interested, take a look at the second chapter of my book that is now in Portuguese. But I want to focus today on the other colonialism that Marx wrote a lot about, and very explicitly favoring anti-colonial resistance, which was Ireland. So the next one. Yeah. So he's writing about Ireland his whole life, and so is Engels. And this is one, if you've read my book, you know that sometimes I point to differences between Marx and Engels, but on Ireland and Poland, there was like never a difference, especially on Ireland. So there's a concept of revolution, though. By 1869, it's not only supporting Irish resistance to imperialism, but the intertwining of Britain, Ireland, and really France, a revolution that would intertwine agrarian peasant uprisings with urban working class uprisings. So one of the things he does in these writings is he shows that anti-Irish prejudice weakens and divides the working class. And you know, I've been writing about this for 30 years, but I didn't realize one thing until just as I was preparing this talk, and we'll go in my second book. This is racism. Marx himself says, as we'll see, it's similar to the attitude of the whites toward the blacks in America, but it's also anti-immigrant prejudice. It's the same sentiment that helped give us Brexit and some of this kind of thing. So it's already there, and Marx is already writing about it. Secondly, super oppression, super exploitation in some ways of the Irish peasant, so that this could spark, this could spill over into Britain, the center of global capitalism, in conjunction with a revolutionary outbreak on the continent, probably in France. So he sees this three-part international uprising. Okay, he writes just without even attempting to justify it, as if kind of everyone would assume this. Well, the next revolution will probably break out in France, as like it always seemed to have done in the 19th century. 1789, 1830, 1848, and of course the Paris Commune. which hadn't happened yet, but was about to happen. Although here's his words, and this, by the way, is in French. It's not in German. Probably closer to Portuguese in terms of just getting it. If you want to read it, just get a grasp exactly what he's saying. Although revolutionary initiative will probably come from France, England alone can serve as the leader for a serious economic revolution. And this is a confidential communication of the International. He continues, writing that colonized Ireland is a weak point where British landlords and capitalists, the two wings of the ruling class, can be attacked most effectively. In the first place, Ireland is the bulwark of English landlordism. If it fell in Ireland, it would fall in England. In Ireland, this is 100 times easier because the economic struggle there is concentrated exclusively on landed property, because the struggle is at the same time national, and because the people there are more revolutionary and angry than in England. Landlordism in Ireland is maintained solely by the English army. The movement of the forced union between the two countries, the moment the forced union ends, a social revolution will immediately break out in Ireland, though in backward form. So not the full modern socialism, but with some socialist tendencies. So what we have here is, you have to remember that Marx never talks just about the capitalists as the enemy. It's the capitalists and the landowning classes, always. Because the time he's writing, like even in places like Britain, the landowning classes maintain a great deal of power, especially in the military. But he also talks about obstacles to this taking place, and one of them is what we would call today, he didn't use these words, but racist and anti-immigrant attitudes of the English workers toward the Irish sub-proletarians inside Britain, many of whom were refugees from the famine of 1846, which was instigated by British, what we call it today, liberal economic policies. And it was just a real disaster, almost of genocidal proportions. So here's what he writes. In the second place, the English bourgeoisie has divided the proletariat into two hostile camps, and all the big industrial centers. Go to the next one. No, okay, say that. The English bourgeoisie has divided the proletariat into two hostile camps in all the big industrial centers of England. There is profound antagonism between the Irish proletarian and the English proletarian. The common English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor, coming in at lower wages. With lowers wages and standard of life, he feels national and religious antipathies for him. So that's all a quote from Marx. Now he continues. He sees the English worker as a victim of bourgeois and aristocratic propaganda, and he focuses here on the mass media too. Now here's where he makes the connection. He views him similarly to how the poor whites of the southern states of North America viewed black slaves. This antagonism among the proletarians of England is artificially nourished and kept up by the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie knows that this split is the true secret of the preservation of its power. Okay, now the next slide. Okay, so this connects us in turn, this mention of its analogy toward the black slaves and former slaves in the United States. This connects to his writings 4 or 5 years earlier on the Civil War in the United States, and he's in Capital. He actually mentions this, and here's the famous quote, at least in the United States, it's a very famous quote. In the United States of America, every independent workers' movement was paralyzed as long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor in a white skin cannot emancipate itself where it is branded in a black skin. That sentence I've seen people put on like posters at demonstrations. A new life immediately arose from the death of slavery. The first fruit of the American Civil War was the 8 hours agitation, which ran from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We started to get the 8-hour day, at least for government workers, already at that time. It took another 50 years for our general working class. And also the first national trade union federation forms. We don't have this in the United States until after the Civil War. Okay, the next one, please. Yeah, so I want to show that this is a change of position for Marx, some of what he's saying here. This is a quote from a letter to Engels. There's another letter to another comrade who he repeats more or less. So this is from 1869. For a long time, I believed it would be possible to overthrow the Irish regime by English working class ascendancy. I always took this viewpoint in the New York Tribune. Deeper study has now convinced me the opposite. The English working class will never accomplish anything before it has got rid of Ireland. The lever must be applied in Ireland. This is why the Irish question is so important for the social movement in general. And his change of position concerns the directionality of the revolution movement. He always thought there'd be a revolution in Ireland, there'd be one in Britain, but he thought it would start in industrially developed Britain, spread over. Now he thinks that because of these weaknesses in the social consciousness of the British working class, English working class, that it's going to need this push from an Irish revolution. So from periphery to center, if you will. So we have here a complex dialectic of revolution, and I would argue that it's richer, it has some similarities to what Trotsky later wrote about permanent revolution, but I think it's more complex and richer. Of course, for Trotsky, Russia was the weak link in the chain of global capitalism. And of course, it's very different from what the Maoists said, which is, that you could break off a less developed country and have socialism in one country. So let me sketch this out. I mean, this is like an interpretation. He doesn't say this explicitly. One, France will probably spark the revolution, but it is not sufficiently industrialized to hold out alone against global capitalism, especially the gigantic, way more developed British capitalism. Two, Irish peasants will also step in, challenging both landlordism, the landed aristocracy, and colonialism in their national liberation struggle for independence. Three, this will weaken the position of the British ruling classes, since landlords stand alongside capitalists and their sons dominate the officer corps in the military. Because the big concern, and this is what happened in the Paris Commune only a year later, is that you could have a revolution in the industrial proletarianized parts of the country, but then the landowning classes would mobilize rural people in the military and come in and crush it. So having an agrarian revolution, it's not just an ally across the water in Ireland, it's like part of the internal mechanism of the British state apparatus, because so much of it is rooted in this particularly landowning aristocratic branch of the ruling classes. Four, the Irish struggle will shake up the conscience of English workers, helping them to overcome some of their racist prejudices. What is the prejudice the British have toward the Irish? It's the typical thing that people have toward immigrant workers. Not that they're revolutionary, but they're taking our jobs because they're willing to work for lower wages, they have no pride, blah, blah, blah. And so where they should feel sympathy when Trump locks people in cages and separates from their parents, instead some people are like, yeah, if we let these people in, they're going to lower our wages. So, but if they see the Irish in a revolution, they're going to have a very different attitude, because their stereotype of the Irish, as we say in English, is someone who kisses the ass of the boss. Pardon my vulgar language. Okay. So, five, both materially weakening the British working class and ideologically undermining Irish prejudice and racism, the Irish Revolution will be the lever that pries open the wider European revolution, although the regional revolution will be opened initially in France. So this is not just like a weak link. This is a complex dialectic, and it has peasants and agrarian forces, as well as urban working class and national forces. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the second one I'll go over much more briefly because it's very well known to most people that have studied Marx, the anti-statist revolution alongside the anti-capitalist one. In the commodity fetishism section of Capital, developed in its final form only after the Paris Commune, the version we have is really perfected, if you want to say that after that. Marx writes that the dialectical opposite to what he calls the distorting lens of commodity fetishism, which hides the actual exploitative relations of labor and also hides the possibility of emancipation. Let us fondly imagine for a change, he writes, an association of free human beings working with the means of production held in common. I don't know what they do in Portuguese, but in German anyway, there's this word Menschen. Almost every time they translate it as man, hombre, or whatever, in English, but in German, there's Mann and there's Menschen. They're two different words. So this could just as easily be translated as Menschen, as human beings, which is what I'm doing, and I've done in some of my translations. So free human beings working with the means of production held in common. But after this conclusion about the working class revolution, also in capital, there's no mention of the state. There's no mention of how we would get to that in the book of Capital. But we can find discussion of that in his writings on the state and revolution. So one of them, of course, is Critique of the Gotha Program, where he famously outlines two phases of communism. And this is something that continues to spark discussion. He attacks relentlessly the Lassallean version of German socialism for their statist concept of socialism. They also thought the landlord class was less of a danger than the capitalist class. He fought hard against them. The German Workers' Party, this is the Lassallean, treats the state rather as an independent entity that possesses its own intellectual, ethical, and libertarian bases. He thinks it's really funny. He also attacks their illusions concerning the Prussian state, a state that is nothing but a police-guarded military despotism embellished with parliamentary forms. So Marx's vision of communism in the Critique of the Gotha Program does not include a state. And we have a new translation into English that I helped work on, and we actually removed the word state, which was a mistranslation in a crucial paragraph. But the more famous writing is the Civil War in France, partly because Lenin and Mao Zedong made so much of this, of 1871, where he also attacks the state as well as capital. And here's what he writes here about the Paris Commune. It wanted to make individual property a truth by transforming the means of production, land and capital, now chiefly the means of enslaving and exploiting labor, into mere instruments of free and associated labor. But this is communism, impossible communism. So that's the quote from Marx. And by the way, he wrote that in English. So I love to tell my German comrades, did you read the original English? They tend to think everything must be in German, and that would be the definitive. Marx was actually trilingual. He wrote maybe a quarter of his writings in English, 10–20% in French, and then the rest in German. As the commune practiced it, a modern social republic of the working class needed to abolish the standing army, the police, and other organs of state repression, substituting a direct proletarian democracy based upon armed citizenry. Thus, it is not abolition of the state in general, for it could be replaced by something even more reactionary like warlordism, because you destroy the state and then you could end up just with a bunch of private armies. But it's positive abolition and replacement by a social republic dominated by a revolutionary working class and popular masses. And he writes of, quote, the destruction of the state power which claimed to be the embodiment of the unity of the nation itself, from which in fact it was the parasitic excrescence. And he writes further that the commune breaks the modern state power. And of course, there was also, it formed the basis for the takeover of some factories by workers' committees, what we called later like Soviets or workers' councils in the 20th century. You start to get that already in the Paris Commune, which we saw in the Russian Revolution, so early 20th century. Now, the Commune did not abolish capitalism, but its abolition of the state created the political form through which to abolish capitalism. It was essentially a working class government, the product of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labor. And Engels later wrote, I think he was right, this is the best, most dramatic example of what Marx meant by dictatorship of the proletariat. In addition, he singles out as heroic the real women of Paris who assumed their part in the Civil War. There was a couple of lines about the women who helped to defend the commune against the right-wing army that ultimately defeated it amid mass executions and deportations. And there's a recent book in English about women in the Paris Commune. This is something, that was already a concern to Marx at that time. And it wasn't as though the Paris Commune had totally great policies on gender, because they still kept to the French tradition of denying the vote to women, even in the Commune. Women could attend the assemblies and speak, but they weren't allowed to vote at that time. Okay, next slide, please. So here's where we see, again, explicit mention of a change of position. Because a year after the Commune, in 1872, he indicates that it had caused him to change his position on the state, compared, for example, to the Communist Manifesto of 1848. So in 1872 preface to a new edition of the Manifesto, he and Engels wrote of several aspects that had become outdated. Among these outdated features were the revolutionary measures proposed at the end of Section 2, which included centralization of credit in the hands of the state and centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Referring to the Paris Commune, where the proletariat for the first time held political power, they write, "One thing especially was proved by the Commune, that is, that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes." So this major change of position was largely ignored by the two largest wings of socialism in the 20th century, Stalinism and social democracy, and pink tide, all of these ignore this, or they reject it. To the next one. Okay, so the third example I want to spend a little more time on, and this is the subject of both of Marx at the margins partially, but my whole next book is a lot of it is devoted to this. So the very, very last years, 1879 to 82, the same ones that Marcelo Musto focuses on in his very good biography of Marx. As is well known, he refers in letters to Russian revolutionaries to communal social forms in Russian villages and the possibility of avoiding capitalism there, especially in his letter to the Russian Revolutionary Bureau Zazulich, and material he drafted in this letter. And that's a photograph of one of those people in one of those communes. So go to the next slide, please. Okay. This concern about the communal village in Russia is also theorized in Marx's last published writing, the new preface co-authored with Engels to the 1882 Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, where he sums up a lot of what he's been thinking about along those lines. If the Russian Revolution becomes a signal for a proletarian revolution in the West, so the two complement each other, then Russia's peasant communal land ownership may serve as the point of departure for a communist development. These writings on Russia are just the tip of the iceberg, however, as they were part of a vast project in which Marx made hundreds of thousands of words of research notes on new work by anthropologists and social historians on India, Indonesia, North Africa, pre-colonial and colonial Latin America, Russia, ancient Rome, pre-colonial Ireland, medieval Europe, and a variety of pre-literate societies, from the indigenous societies of the Americas. He even starts one of them with the Botocudos, if I'm pronouncing that right, an early society in Brazil. There's a little mention of that. But the indigenous societies, these clan-based societies, also going back to the Greeks, as reflected in Homer's Iliad and so forth, also looking at physical anthropology and paleontology, with some of this obviously having something to do with ecology and environment. As the recent work by Kohei Sato, I don't know if this is Degrowth Communism, it's a widely, already being very widely read, although it was published only this year. So the next slide, please. So as he writes, it's obvious that he has a new idea about revolution, starting in the Russian communal villages and then maybe spreading into the Western proletariat. But my argument is that all these studies, or almost all these studies of communal societies are related to this project of rethinking revolution. As he states explicitly, resistance on the part of Russia's communal villages to capitalist encroachment could form the point of departure, in German Ausgangspunkt, for a European revolution if it also involved the Western proletariat. These villages are more communistic in their internal relations than the Western European village under feudalism or what was remaining under capitalism. 2, in his notes on Algeria's communal villages and their resistance to French imperialism, he connects the fear of the French ruling classes over this resistance to their fear of the Paris Commune that broke out under their very noses in 1871. So actually in the debates of the National Assembly, they're saying we've got to get rid of communism in both Paris and Algeria. That there actually is a fear that the village communes could be the basis for organizing peasant resistance to imperialism, and also the recurrent fear of a return of the Paris Commune. I guess he's reading a book about the French resistance, and as late as 1944, the Americans didn't like de Gaulle, but they agreed that he could lead the march into Paris because he came to them and he said, look, if I don't march in, the Reds are going to take over those neighborhoods, and we're going to have another Paris Commune. So it isn't as Eisenhower, they knew about it. They might not talk about it, but they knew about it. And believe me, in the 1870s in France, that was a very visceral fear. Okay. Next slide, please. No, sorry, go back. Sorry, my mistake. The last one is the Indian subcontinent. There, the world covered most extensively in his research at the end of his life. He writes that the persistence, along with important evolutions of communal social structures that persisted for thousands of years. This remained even after these structures were severely undermined by market and privatization measures enacted under the British in the 1790s. So the British come in and they really undermine and create capitalist social relations to a great degree in these villages. Nonetheless, important communistic remnants persisted, and these underlay some of the uprisings against the British, including the rebel Shivaji against the Mughal Empire. You might not know his name, but the big train station in Mumbai is the Shivaji terminus. So he's like one of the real heroes of Indian independence. And 5, in his notes on Ireland and Native Americans, because he makes notes at the end of his life, he frequently singles out the social power of women in the days before colonialism. While he doesn't state as much explicitly, this probably made gender also a locus of resistance for him. I mean, there's a lot of mentions of gender and even extensive analysis of it, in these notes. But there's no explicit reference to a change of position on Marx's part. Still, I think those changes are clear. 1, in the earlier period, he viewed Russia as an utterly reactionary power, but now Russia could be the starting point of a wider revolution inside its villages. So you have to remember, in 1848, when almost all the European countries had revolutions except for Britain, Russia was relatively silent, and then they used the Russian troops to come in and crush the uprising. 2, in the earlier period, he also disparaged Indian societies unchanging and unresisting, notoriously seeing British imperialism as offering a degree of progress, albeit in a barbaric, destructive manner, which was a centerpiece of, at least to Marxist, sometimes a notorious book by Edward Said, or Orientalism. Now, Marx supports resistance to the British and finds positive elements in the Indian village. 3, in the earlier period, had little awareness except occasionally in Ireland of the social power held by women in pre-colonial, pre-capitalist societies. Okay. Next slide. Oh, we're already there. Okay. In his last years, Marx developed 3 new concepts of revolution alongside that of the united working class uprising. 1, British workers' revolution sparked by revolt in France and especially by an agrarian and national revolution in Ireland, which would shake up the racialized false consciousness of the British workers and unite them with their immigrant Irish co-workers. 2. Revolution that targets and abolishes the modern centralized state with an emancipatory alternative, as in the Paris Commune, as a prerequisite for the abolition of capitalism itself. 3. Revolution beginning in a non-capitalist agrarian society like Russia, with communal village systems, which in resisting capitalist encroachments would also connect to the revolutionary labor movement of Western Europe, the more industrially developed part of the world. Thank you very much.
Bom, pessoal, nós passamos agora a segunda etapa dessa conversa aqui à tarde, que a gente está esperando ouvir questões, comentários, sugestões para responder, reagir a isso. A gente vai organizar da seguinte forma: vou coletar 3, 4 questões para ele responder em bloco, pedir às pessoas que venham aqui à frente, porque a gente está filmando para poder colocar nas redes, no YouTube, depois. E se alguém tiver dificuldade de perguntar em inglês, pode perguntar em português e eu tento, de alguma forma, passar para ele aqui a pergunta. Não sei se muito bem, mas tentarei fazer isso. Não fiquem tímidos. Se puder vir aqui à frente. E eu pedi também para todo mundo se identificar quando fizer a pergunta, fica mais fácil. Pode? Aí está ótimo. Só se identificar e mandar.
Professor Anderson, I'm so glad to be here to see my presentation. My name is Ian. I work here. I study here. It's some kind of work, right? I'm on graduation. I think it's that.
Yeah.
I'm graduating here, mastering in economics. My question. I'll try to formulate it while I'm speaking, so perhaps it might not be so much clear, but I'll try my best. It is wide studied, Marx's conception of history, materialistic conception of history. Some say Marx's theory of history, others prefer not to. I think because the theory of history sometimes is related to the philosophy of history. So sometimes one may think that it has inherently some kind of teleological thought of history, which I'm pretty sure Marx did not have. But my question is, do you think Marx has a theory of history? If he does, what is his theory of history or his materialistic conception of history in the light of the changes that you brought to us on the revolutionary thought, the concept of revolution? I think that's it. Thank you.
Pode vir aqui à frente.
Well, hello, Professor. It is really nice to see you and to meet you personally. My name is Gabriel. I am doing a master's degree in sociology at the State University of Campinas here in Brazil. And I'll try to say to you my question, but it's basically thinking about your work, Marx, at the margins. that I've heard some authors saying that you have a kind of conception that say that Marx, in his latest years, are now having a new point for the revolution. That is not anymore the working class of the British industrial society, but is only maybe exactly the margins with maybe with another point of views, considering his anthropological notes. And some people say that in your book there is this kind of notion that Marx is disconsidering the industrial working class and saying stating new paths for revolution. And I don't know, but by your presentation, I think that you were saying that Marx is agreeing with the revolution in the Europe and with England, France, but also knowing new forms of resistance that can boost the revolution worldwide. And you know, this is a great discussion even in the 20th century with Trotsky, for example, defending the importance of the working class, of course, alongside the peasants, but other studies saying that maybe the peasants is the way and so on. So I want you to say, what's your opinion on that? And Marx, in his latest years, abandoned his conception of the importance of revolution in industrial countries, or no, that's not what you're saying. Well, that's it. Thank you very much.
Mas ok? Pode ir se aproximando também.
Good afternoon. Congratulations for the book and the conference. My name is Laurenio Sombra, professor of philosophy at the Universidade Estadual de Feira de Santana. Well, if there are this change in Marx, old Marx, about gender, race, the vision of state, etc., how can we think about the change in theory of Marx? Think about a new theory for include this changement, or can we think about a new kind of theory that can think about that changement in Marx?
Hello, my name is Ana. I'm doing my master's in Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, Federal University of Minas Gerais, and I research Marxist critique of Maine in the ethnological notebooks. And yeah, I like your work, and I would like you to talk about a little bit, if you could, about the differences and similarities of the communal villages, as you said here, in Algeria and in Russia, if Marx has stated some differences between them, and also with the communal structures that are left in India. If you could also relate it to Marx's notes on Morgan, it would be very cool. Thank you.
Acho que a gente tem primeiro bloco, né?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll take these questions one by one. Yeah, on the question of the theory of history, of philosophy of history, does he have a theory of history? Well, he kind of denies, like in this 1877 letter, that he has a general theory of history. But of course, he does have the modes of production. I think it's a very powerful theoretical innovation. I mean, it was already in some of the political economists, but he develops it further. So the idea of having an ancient, a feudal, capitalist mode of production. The problem with it is, and there's nothing, the great part of it is that therefore the laws of, or even the social structures of capitalism are not the same as under feudalism or the ancient Greco-Roman world. The problem is one of the sources of teleology that's not Marx's fault was that the German ideology was published and this had this thing, and this became like the Bible of the Stalinist systems and many other forms. But it wasn't only the Stalinists. This guy Kovalevsky, who wrote the book on that discussed Algeria and India that I was talking about, that Marx was noting on, Kovalevsky himself says feudalism for India, and Marx says no, this is not feudalism. So, because one of the problems with the teleological analysis in terms of the topic of this lecture is revolution, is you get to the stages theory of revolution, whereby you have to go through, if everything is feudalism, then you're not capitalist yet, so you have to go through capitalism and all that stuff. So Marx is very interested at the end of his life in the differences between these various agrarian societies. And in my new book, there's actually a chapter called Three Agrarian Societies, Russia, India, and the other one he's looking at where those notes have never been published, but I have access to them through this earlier work I did with the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, ancient Roman Greece. So he's writing about the transition, taking a lot of notes, which have a lot also to do with gender, on the transition from a kind of a free peasantry in ancient Rome to an urbanized proletariat and a large latifundia, because that's a very old expression. It didn't start in Latin America, but yet it didn't arrive at capitalism. Then he looks at Russia and he says, well, they may not necessarily be going toward capitalism either. He looks at India; they're already very strongly under the domination of British capitalism, but still they're not. These agrarian relations are not fully capitalist yet. I'm going to talk about. I'm giving a talk next Thursday here at another conference where I'm going to talk about this in greater detail. Okay, so I would say that it's an evolving theory of history. I think there still is always with Marx an idea of progress, and Marx is not Nietzsche. He's not Adorno. From progress, from the slingshot to the megaton. There is a notion of progress. This comes out, for example, you can see it in his writings on the Civil War. But as a Hegelian, because Hegel is accused of this Whig, we call it a Whiggish concept of history in English. With Hegel and with Marx, there's also retrogression. One of the people that has a good essay on this is George Lukács in an unknown book, the Young Hegel, where he talks not just about progress, but for Hegel, it was about retrogression also. And of course, Lukács used that to discuss fascism. My mentor, Raya Nievskaya, wrote about it in other ways. She used it to discuss a critique actually of Chairman Mao. It's complicated, I can't go into it. But I don't think Marx is ever only about progress, because like the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, this is a retrogression when France has this coup. Okay. What about the working class? Where does it leave the working class? I want to just say something autobiographical. I was never even a Trotskyist, let alone a Stalinist. I was a little bit Maoist when I was young, but in a way, like I was an anarchist at the same time, so it was very eclectic. So when I started becoming a serious Marxist, I was trained in Marxism by Raya Nievskaya, who was the secretary to Trotsky, but also worked with I think C.L.R. James is better known in Brazil, because Nievskaya has never been translated. And so I was schooled on, yes, there's a working class, and we're not the new left, so we're not Herbert Marcuse, so we don't think the workers are all like, so prosperous and so on. But we were always told 4 forces of revolution: the workers, the rank and file workers, not the bureaucracy, but the rank and file. and then women, youth, and black people. And then later that was expanded to include other minorities. So that's the way, and we were told that in America, in the history of the US, it was black masses as vanguard. That if you looked at the various social struggles, you could almost always find black people in the forefront. And then in the period after Trump was elected, some people were saying, well, he's attacking the Latinos and the Arabs so much, and we have a lot of Latinos, people of Mexican and other, and this is the term we use in the United States, for people from Latin America, immigrants, that they were getting pretty revolutionary, and they were, but then Black Lives Matter happened, and so there it was again. So I don't think he ever gives up on the working class. Personally, I never did either, but I think it's never only the working class. And with any of these groups, we can talk about the black movement, but we can also talk about how, there's black billionaires and who are not progressive. And we can talk about the working class, but we can talk about the trade union bureaucracy, which they were the first group to meet with Trump, after he was elected, to see if they could work together. So I don't see it, and I think Marx was already going in that direction, and certainly by the end of his life, very much so with these writings on Ireland. Okay, the state, I think these later writings point to a new theory, but I don't think it's like a break. It's not like I'm saying some people think, oh, well, that sentence I read from Capital at the beginning, he gets rid of that in his late writings. Other people say, well, the late writings, oh, well, that was all preparation for volumes 2 and 3 of Capital. I'm not sure about that either, because Marx wrote a lot of things in his life that were not directly related to the project of the book Capital, like the 18th Premier of Louis Bonaparte, the Civil War in France. There are all these political writings, and other kinds of philosophical writings too. I think there is a change, but I don't think it's a break. In Marx at the Margins, I called it an evolution. What I'm stressing today in my new book is just isolating this period of the late Marx, which has become, with Musto's book, my book, Musto's book, and then this book by Kohei Sato that has just come out, there really is a global discussion now of the late Marx, which I started working on this with my mentor, Raya Denievskaya, one of the first to write about this, the ethnological notebooks and gender. That was the 1980s, and I remember giving a talk or something, and someone said, oh, so is the late Marx going to become like what the young Marx was? And they said that everyone, and I said, yeah, I think so, but I was about 40 years. I was wrong, but if you live long enough, sometimes things that are wrong become right. So we now have this topic, and I think this is really a point we have to investigate. I'm still thinking about it too, but part of why I wanted to come here was to test out some of this, because I'm basically presenting on the book. I haven't published it, and it's going to change as a result of what you tell me. Okay, the last one, this is, my whole book tries to cover this, and there's a lot of other books by people like Lawrence Crater initially, and Raya Denievskaya in the 1970s and 80s, and then up through today. So, Henry Sumner Maine was way more important than Morgan or any of these people. At the time, he held a chair at Oxford or one of those places, and he recognized that these communal social forms in these villages in India and Ireland were different from the British or French feudalism. He did recognize it, so he was sharp enough to figure that out. However, he thought this was terrible. He said this was similar to Max Weber later when he writes on the 1905 revolution in Russia. Yeah, this communal thing, this is like why Russia is so undeveloped. This is going to hold they've got to get with it and get a concept of individualism and private property, or they're never going to go forward. So this was Maine's position. So Marx just, in his notes on Maine, Marx really attacks him. And where Maine was really wrong, like so many of the researchers at that time, is that he constantly tries to find male leaders, even in these obviously matrilineal or societies with even some matriarchal aspect. He constantly twists the evidence to make it male dominated. So this is a major part of the, I mean, along with the notes on Morgan, these notes on Maine is probably the most important part of these ethnological notebooks. Of course, Marx loved Morgan, although he was critical of Morgan. Kovalevsky, this other guy that I was using for a lot of today's talk, Kovalevsky was a friend, and Morgan was very appreciated by Marx, although he's more critical of him than I think Engels realized. Okay, now, just to keep it brief, okay, and the notes on Morgan are where the theme of gender comes up most extensively and forcefully. And it's a little bit of an intellectual problem for a book like mine, because there isn't a sentence anywhere where Marx says, well, the villages of Russia, and then women in some of these pre-capitalist societies where women have greater social power. He never actually explicitly says that. But I think one could construct that, perhaps, from what he's looking at. Of course, he never published anything. The only thing he ever published on this is that one paragraph in the Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto. Not even a draft manuscript. It's just all like notes. They're notebooks. Okay, Algeria, Russia, and India. Yeah, well, let's go from Russia. Okay, Russia, he thinks has the most revolutionary potential in the immediate sense because Russia is not a colonized society, so it has a weak pre-capitalist monarchy. It's going to be much easier to overthrow. Also, capitalist social relations have not encroached to the same extent. India is under British rule, but you know it's a gigantic country. The British only have like 10. They never had more than 10,000 or 20,000 soldiers there, and the country already was hundreds of millions. So this again, they never fully dominated the cultures or the society in the way that they wanted to. So even when these laws are passed to privatize the village, still a lot of these social forms remain. I think one way to think about it is that in Bolivia, not that I'm an expert on this, but I've read that the peasants come into the capital in these barrios and they reproduce some of the relations. They continue some of the relations, obviously in a different economic system from the rural areas. So he's very interested in that, you know, in India. And then finally, Algeria, it's a small country. It's a settler colonialism. So the French domination is just really, really powerful and overwhelming. But because it's so fierce and vicious and brutal, that then there still is resistance. So each of them is very different. And of course, the French state is much more sophisticated than the British state because the French know what a revolution is, know what a revolutionary threat is, and so they're very aware of that in a way. The British are kind of taken by surprise by this big uprising that I'm going to talk about next week, the Sepoy uprising of 1858. Because another place where Marx singles out the participation of women as leaders, there were some women generals fighting against the British.
Thank you, Kevin. Então, vamos abrir mais um bloco de perguntas. Marco, lá, você aqui. Podem.
Good afternoon, Professor Anderson. I'd like to thank you very much for your lecture. My name is Marco. I'm a professor here at the Universidade Federal Fluminense at the Department of Social Work. And I would like to ask you two questions, if you could answer them. The first one is concerning the topics that you highlighted in your last slide. The three topics concerning the theory of revolution of the late Marx. My question is, do you think he ever came to sketch or outline some kind of model that integrated those three topics, or they were kind of isolated topics? He was like exploring some possibilities. Okay. So, and the other question is, you showed that there was some kind of shift in his thought toward these margins. But in this period, did he wrote more significant papers or works or I don't know articles on the British working class movement, like the trade unions, and this shift towards the margins? Did it impact his conception of the political role of this trade union movement in England or something like that? Thank you.
So thank you, Professor. It's a real pleasure to be here and to listen to you. And I would like to try to make a question. It's kind of the first. It sounds like the first question of my partner here, and it's about somehow the tension in Marxist works between the concrete history and the theory. I mean, some people nowadays are trying to connect all these questions by what we call unitarian theory, and somehow they try to do it by mobilizing some categories like value and workforce. I mean, there's these people trying not to create new categories and try to work with this capital or the capital categories. You think that Marx this when he highlight these new expressions of oppression and this, he tried to connect, to think about a theory to like to connect with his value theory and this all of his capital, his mass work.
Hi, I'm Janaína, lecturer at UFVJM. My question, I have actually two questions. The first one is about a comment you made that Marx changed his mind about the centralization of the credit system in the hands of the state, possible transition to socialism and capitalism. And this is a theme in imperialist theory, and I never heard that. So if you could expand a little bit more on this, I would be very interested. And the second thing I would like to you to expand a little bit more, if you could, is about your argument that all these notebooks, they were not meant for possible continuation of Marxist capital. Why am I asking this? Because in the Gundras, he sets the 6-book plan, and there is a whole bunch of discussions within Marxism on whether he kept that plan or he abandoned it. So, and in his practice, right, of always writing notebooks and studying, and then polishing the argument and the exposition before publishing. So why do you exclude this possibility or of being notebooks of preparation for possible continuations on the stage, for example? even in the 1850s, when the London notebooks, there are many elements there about women as well and other topics. So those would be my questions. Thank you.
Mais alguma questão? Vamos passar para o Kevin novamente. Acho que já tem um bom bloco aí. Foram 3 pessoas, mas 5 questões, Kevin.
Yeah, okay. Marco, thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. Is there a model? Well, no, there isn't one. Maybe in Ireland, slightly in that couple pages where he talks about the model of France, England and Ireland, the working class and agrarian revolutions intersecting. Once in a while you see references, like I mentioned, in the notes on Algeria, he does mention the Paris Commune. There are these debates in the French National Assembly at that time. What else? These are not the only things he writes about. Okay, he publishes almost no articles after 1875. Okay, and so in this period of these notebooks, he doesn't publish. Just that preface to the Communist Manifesto is one of the only ones. I mean, there's a few like speeches at a Polish anniversary dinner that's published, things like that. 1881, I believe it was. So not a lot of publications, a lot of research. But these are not the only notebooks. So Marcelo Musco has a good survey of this everything. So what I'm talking about today, and even in Marx at the Margins and my next book, this is only a part of what he's working on. What are some of the other things he spends a lot of time on this period? Mathematical notebooks. And also, I think it's going to be several thousand pages in the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe when it's published. Notes on a book about world history, but it's really European history, from the earliest times up through the Peace of Westphalia at 1648. So some people think that this is related to, we'll kind of transition into Janina's question for a second, or comment. This may be related to the unfinished book on the state, for example. And some of what he writes about Henry Sumner Maine is obviously related to the state. So shifting to that, to Janina's question, yeah, I don't know what he means when he says, exactly, when he says we don't need those expressions, except at a general level that if you read the critique of the Gotha program, he constantly hammers away against the Lassalleans who are saying we want state control, we want education, state this, state that. And we did work on some of this in the way he talked about value and so forth in the critique of the Gotha program in our translation, Peter Hudis' introduction. I didn't really mean it. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I said it, but you say we're misquoted. I don't know exactly what I said, but I thought I said that I don't agree with the idea that this is all about, notes for the next edition of Capital. Or the subsequent, what he thought of, what we have as volumes 2 and 3 and theories of surplus value, he thought that was going to be volume 2 of Capital. So, yeah, this is something I think about a lot. Of course, it's an unknowable question. What we do know is even drafts of volume 2, what became volume 2 is the last one, as I understand it, that he worked on even in draft form, mid 1876, 77, but not after that. Because as a lot of people don't know, what became volumes 2 and 3 of Capital was written before volume 1, except for that little part that he played with a little bit in the 1870s. My mentor once wrote, Donetskaya, that maybe we didn't know all these notes at that time, but we did know about the Zazulich letters, and we did know, because he wrote a lot of stuff about agriculture in the United States, too. in these late writings. And so she said that, well, Russia and America would become as crucial as Britain for volume 2 and 3. But if we want to accept that logic, we could say that India and these other places as well would become essential. So we really don't know. I don't mean to exclude that possibility. All I mean to say is that partly because Marx gave that list of 6 books, these are not capital, it's just one of the 6 books. Okay, and then lastly, the second question, concrete history and a unitary theory. I mean, this is one of the ways that people say that Marx is a 19th century thinker, like Foucault was a thing, like a fish in the water of the 19th century, but a fish out of water afterwards. So I don't think that holds when you look at these kinds of writings. I think these make Marx our contemporary. But of course, there is a theoretical model, but it's very rare that Marx says anything about all modes of production through human history. He does make a lot of generalizations about capitalist societies. But the issue is, what did he think about at the time he was writing these societies that were not yet fully capitalist? So today what people say is, oh yeah, these people like Anderson or Sato that write about this, yeah, this is interesting, but everywhere today the value form dominates everything. So it's interesting but not relevant. And I kind of said that at the end of Marx at the margins, that, well, that part is less relevant today than the part about nationalism, ethnicity, and racism. But I think I was wrong. And I was over in China lecturing on the book just before I published it, and the Chinese students and scholars were really pressing me, like there's only one way of development, come on, so on. And so I think I made too many concessions to that. So I want to go back to what I said a moment ago about the Bolivian village migrates to the city, and it isn't always good. They say the Anatolian village has migrated to Istanbul, and this is part of the basis of the right-wing populist semi-religious nationalism. So it doesn't have to go always in a revolutionary direction. But I think, there's a lot more remnants that survive inside a newer mode of production. And those old things can become a basis for positive change under certain conditions.
Então, estamos prontos aí para mais uma rodada de perguntas. Alguém se voluntaria? Pode vir aqui.
Hello. I'm a history major.
Você pode ir um pouquinho para o lado, porque você está bem na frente da câmera.
Sorry. I'm a history major. I'm still graduating. I started this year, actually. But my question is that I was very curious about something that you said about Marx and the Civil War in America. And I was thinking about how you were talking about the relationship between, Ireland workers and British workers, and sort of how that logistic can apply to post-Civil America in between like Black people and white people and sort of post-slavery. Like, how was that dynamic in America, and can you apply that sort of same logistic to it? Because it is a different sort of logic, in the system, but how is it similar and how is it different, and how does, the race in America and the slavery in America plays a role in, the social relationships between the workers and the, race and stuff.
Eu vou fazer uma pergunta, então, para o Kevin. Kevin, in your talk, you showed how Marx was more concerned with racial question, colonial question, gender question in his late writings, but also in the relationship between proletarians and peasants, and urban workers and rural workers. And it's connected with the colonial question, but not only with that. Well, in his prison notebooks, Antonio Gramsci used this idea of subaltern social groups or subaltern classes to think about the social subject of the revolution. It has an historical sense because all the oppressed and exploited in modern figures of history were subaltern groups for Gramsci, but it has a specific contemporary sense, thinking a kind of united front, social united front between urban workers and rural peasants. And Gramsci was thinking about the revolution in Italy and the difference between the industrialized north area of Italy and the rural south, but also in Russian revolution and in the alliance between peasants and proletarians in Russian revolution. Is it possible to say, from what you showed to us, that Marx was elaborating something in that direction on his late writings in what it concerns to his theory of revolution of the social subject or the protagonists of the revolution? Is there something that we can do this parallel with the idea of subaltern social groups? No. No.
Good afternoon. My name is Thiago. I'm here from WUF, undergraduate student in economy, and I have a question. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very pleasant. And I have a question about those mathematical notebooks of Marx in his late days, because it's more curiosity. What we see is that, it's like if Marx were doing puzzle words, there is no connection insofar I can understand or I read about of these studies in mathematics with the other subjects that took his time for the late days. Do you see any connection in these the subjects?
Good afternoon. Eu vou falar em português. Vou abrir a possibilidade de outras pessoas falarem em português, because I'm speaking English but bad English. Okay. My first question is, Dona Ética, ela comenta que o papel das revoluções e dos movimentos em trazer à tona publicações do Marx. Né? E ela fala de movimentos sociais, de revoluções, e como que isso trouxe novos escritos do Marx à tona e trabalhar com esses escritos do Marx. Você quer trazer no final ou
Vai ser muito longa a questão?
não? Tá. E aí a pergunta quando a gente está trabalhando com os parâmetros etnológicos em especial, né, a gente tem muitos assuntos que Marx trata ali, né, questões de colonialismo, de raça, de gênero, sobre progresso, né, a ruptura com o progresso, com o progressismo da sociedade capitalista e tal, que são coisas que a gente está debatendo muito atualmente. Né? Então, o que eu queria trazer, a pergunta é um pouco, como que você vê a conjuntura, como que é a conjuntura atual, ela ajuda a resgatar esses escritos tardios do Marx, em especial dos cadernos etimológicos, e como que você encara as possibilidades de pesquisa e de conclusões que a gente pode chegar a partir desse material, que é um material pouco trabalhado ainda hoje em dia e que tem muito a ser explorado. Então, a sua visão como pesquisador que trabalha já com esse material, como que você vê, com otimismo ou não, e que tipos de aberturas, para além do que você já trabalhou e já levantou aqui, ou adentrando um pouco mais, a gente tem como perspectiva para trabalhar com esses materiais, né? De aberturas de pesquisa, de temas e tudo mais, que, inclusive, muitas vezes quebram com paradigmas e com questões do que o Marx estava colocando antes, que é o que você traz no seu estudo, né? Então, essa é a primeira pergunta, né, de como que você vê as possibilidades de trabalho com esse material. E a segunda é para aproveitar que você está aqui e perguntar mais, você já comentou algumas coisas sobre questão de gênero nesses escritos do Marx e tal, e se você tiver mais alguma coisa para falar para a gente, eu estudo esse tema, então tenho muito interesse.
Ó, gente, está aberto em português, né?
Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody. Yeah, Marx and race. I mean, I have a chapter on this in Marx at the margins, and I've just published a brief article in Monthly Review, the U.S. journal. But there's going to be a book coming out by August Mintz with Historical Materialism series, probably next year, about Karl Marx, Frederick Douglass, and race in the United States. An entire book devoted to this. That's going to be a very, very good book. Yeah, I think there's three axes of discussion here. One is obviously what Marx says in those Irish writings, which is that white racism has held back class consciousness in the United States and continues to. The second one is, again, reproduced a little bit in those Irish writings in a different way, is the idea of blacks in the forefront, because he's very interested. It's not just blacks as victims or as race as undermining class consciousness. There's positive aspects too. The black people in America are the most revolutionary group, historically and at present. And so he's very interested, for example, in the John Brown uprising of 1859 in Virginia that I'm sure a lot of you are aware of. So he celebrates that and writes a letter to Engels about that. Also interested in, under state sponsorship, blacks fighting in the Civil War, defeating and capturing whites. I mean, this really was revolutionary in the sense upsetting their consciousness. But the third aspect is like after the Civil War, what the possibilities are, because we have the poor whites of the South, where the very few whites owned any slaves. The vast majority did not own slaves. They were poor farmers. And so there were incipient periods of unity in those rural areas, and then of course the possibility of unity across racial lines in the urban proletariat. So he's interested in that aspect too. And there's a letter from August Wedemeyer that's included in, I don't think your version of the Civil War writings, but in the American one it is, and Wedemeyer says he was Marx's best guy, so to speak, in America. And he says, these redneck whites, we should just forget about them. You know, basically the white Trump, those white workers, I don't say they all do, but just forget about them, their reaction. That was never Marx's position. He always thought there's possibility, just as, you know, in my opinion, the real Marxists that during and after World War II did not say the Germans. They did not talk about collective guilt of the German people, but they saw that there were divisions inside even Nazi Germany, where there wasn't huge revolt as there was in Italy finally against fascism. Still, there were social classes, there was resistance, and there was certainly potential for future of revolutionary workers' movement. So you never want to give up on that. Okay, so somebody else would be said about race, especially in the United States, and class. Okay, Marcelo's points about subalterns, yeah, definitely, but this is early on. Marx never gives up on the peasantry. I mean, Engels writes the Peasant War in Germany, I think that's 1852 or 56, and then Marx says that we need a second edition of the Peasant War in Germany today. So it's always a thing. In the Paris Commune, one of the problems with the Paris Commune is that it remained isolated inside the city of Paris, and so the rural areas were able to mobilize against it. But he doesn't think that the rural areas are permanently reactionary. We have to wait for society to be more urbanized. He thinks we have to work inside the rural areas. And of course, Bakunin was Marx's comrade still at that time, and the Bakuninist movement had its deepest following inside those villages. The landless laborers in the villages across Italy and Spain and a lot of places, probably here too, were anarchists and definitely revolutionary in those days. So yeah, Marx is definitely interested in some kind of united front of these various social forces and groups. He's willing to make concessions to gain his support. For example, and here's where he fights with the Bakuninists. Bakunists, you become openly an atheist, and you put that in the political program. You also say you're against all inheritance. Well, you just lost most of the peasants with those two sentences. So Marx kept that up. He personally is an atheist, of course, and he ridicules religion, but he keeps that out of any of the political programs, and he keeps abolition of inheritance out of it. So yeah, you have to do, and you sometimes have to make concessions of, okay, yeah, are these mathematical notebooks related to any other stuff he's doing? Well, there's a lot of other work on sciences. I mean, some of this stuff is on geology. The idea that human existence went back hundreds of times a year is a new thing in the 1870s. And so Marx is reading about cave dwellers in Britain. So it's in a way anthropological. In a way, you could say it's connected to the notes on Morgan, but it's only peripherally so. And so we could see mathematics and science as areas of research. Obviously, you need to keep up on that if he was ever going to return to the critique of political economy and finish those books. And I'm not a specialist in math, and I've looked at the mathematical notebooks, part of which is in English, but he does, there is something about the negation of negation in there, and he agrees a little bit with Hegel's critique of calculus. Not because he thinks it's fundamentally wrong, but there's certain assumptions that calculus makes that he's in disagreement with. He thinks they're undialectic. Okay. The last one from Danielle. Okay, what is the usefulness of this stuff today? Okay, first of all, I didn't mention this. I mentioned a lot of the talks I give, at least at my university, which is California is a progressive state. We don't have, in this, our social department, we don't have that many people getting up and saying, you know, capitalism is a good thing, and the U.S. should invade more countries. No one says that. So what a lot of my colleagues say is that there's a lot of theories that are a lot more revolutionary than Marx, because Marx never dealt with gender or race. That's what they repeat constantly. And so this kind of research shows that that's not, first of all, that's not true. It kind of answers these people, like I mentioned Edward Said before, but there's many, many others, decolonial thinkers and so forth. But I think it has to be a dialogue. I'm willing to, I admit in my book that, you know, some of the early writings by Marx on India are very problematic. Some of the things that it's even racist. Okay, as far as gender, I mean, I think it runs through, first of all, Marx always is concerned with gender. You can find it in 1844, a very strong statement about gender. And my former student, Heather Brown, has, in my opinion, the best book, like this kind of surveying everything Marx said about gender, you know, throughout his life, from the beginning to the late writings. In terms of the late writings, where does gender come up the most? Well, in the notes on Morgan, where he looks at the Iroquois and other indigenous groups and their gender relations, which he sees as more egalitarian, but never to the full extent as Engels did. Because Engels wants to say that we should change the sentence in the manifesto that says all history is a history of class struggle. Whereas Marx tends to see incipient classes forming even among these indigenous communal societies. It was mentioned that the notes on Henry Sumner Maine, where it's more of an attack on Maine. The notes, there's a book on the history of the family in ancient Rome. The notes there are fairly lengthy. I've looked at those. Heather Brown summarizes them. We both had access to it, but those are not published, and unfortunately, they're not going to be published anytime soon. I mentioned brief references in the Paris Commune and India writings to women. Nothing that I know of on women in the Russian village, though. So you know, this is, we could say, oh well, these are totally separate things, or we could say that, you know, these notes are toward unfinished work, and he was going to maybe find a way of connecting it. But we certainly need to make gender I mean, I didn't in Marx at the margins. I was focused on colonialism and race and ethnicity. But in my new book, I think that was not a good decision, actually, looking back. I should have found a way to write more about gender. I should have realized that people are going to take the book as kind of a summary of the late Marx. So in my new book, I'm going to address gender more, and so there's a chapter on gender that'll be happy, you know, be really interested in getting people's responses to it. It's not the topic of today's.
Bom, nós temos tempo, se alguém ainda quiser fazer algum questionamento, algum comentário.
Yeah, there's one other issue, which is, okay, so you prove that Marx wrote about gender and race, but lots of people write about that today, so isn't that great that he anticipated all the great stuff we have today, but why is it important? Well, that's what the issue is, I think. The way that Marx connects together these different issues, he does it at a general level, but again, I mean, I'm a Hegelian, but of an unusual sort, because I, you know, rest almost everything I say where Hegel says, we're not going to have a night in which all cows are black. This is the preface of the phenomenon. We're not going to have a universal that's so universalizing that it erases different. So Marx is always about universals, but he's always also about particulars and not having a type of abstract universal that swallows up all that. And it's true when he talks about revolution, it's true when he talks about the nature of capitalism itself, that it's different, and it's also true that even societies that are penetrated by capitalism, like India, they're not fully capitalist in the way that Britain is, but even Britain is not fully capitalist. Nowhere is fully. Certain social relations persist. Because I tell students, like, when you borrow money from your parents, they don't charge you the standard rate of interest. They're non-capitalist.
Se você puder vir mais um pouquinho para cá, para aparecer aqui.
Pode ser melhor.
Meu nome é Evelyn. Eu não vou falar inglês porque eu não sei falar. Mas eu estou vendo que está sendo transmitido pelo StreamYard, então eu uso que vai para o YouTube, então depois eu vou ver a tradução. Eu sou cientista social formada pela UF, e o seu livro foi muito importante para mim, o Marx nas margens, durante a pandemia. Quando eu comecei meu processo de radicalização, uma das fontes foi o livro do Kevin Anderson. E eu gostaria de perguntar para ele só como ele vê o crescimento, porque aqui no Brasil a gente está acompanhando um crescimento muito grande dos movimentos comunistas na internet, e como se ele observa o mesmo movimento nos Estados Unidos, e como ele vê isso.
Mais alguma questão? Eu acho que eu vou, então, passar para o Kevin responder essa última questão e fazer os comentários finais da fala dele. Viu? Nós também já estamos explorando ele com questões aqui há muito mais tempo do que a exposição inicial, acho que. Né?
All right, I'm sorry, Professor, I'm here again. I'm doing this question for a friend of mine that is kind of shy, but I thought it was an interesting question. What is your thoughts about the social theory of reproduction? You know, thinking about great Marxist women like Tici Bhattacharya, Cinzia Ruza, and how they are thinking about gender and relating the system of totality of capital and so on. And I wanted only to know if you are reading these authors, what you're thinking of them. And I think one last question, do you think it is more easier to be Marxist nowadays in the United States, especially in California, or it's kind of hard to live that with radical thoughts? That's it, thank you, and I'm sorry for being here again.
Essa foi a última mesmo? Tudo bem, se tiver outra. Vou passar aqui, então, para o Kevin.
Yeah, the first question or comment first. Yeah, thank you all. I'm glad you found something in the book.
As far as the internet, I mean, yeah, we have a lot of internet radicalization. going on in the United States. I mean, you have to realize the United States is I'm sure you know, like Texas is not the same thing as California, because it's not the same thing as Iowa. So, like they're banning some things in Texas, at the same time they're requiring it in the schools. In California, my granddaughter is taking a Black History class at age 14 in her school in California, you know. But that's not, and whereas in Texas and Florida, they're almost like banning. So everyone talks about the right-wing radicalization, but there's a young man who's come around into this study group I have on Marxism at our university, and he's read like Parts of Capital, definitely like State and Revolution by Lenin, a bunch of stuff. He even knows Russian that he learned at the university. So I thought he'd been in like 2 or 3 socialist groups. He said, no, he just like in high school started like reading this stuff on the internet. And he's obviously brilliant also. But so we have left-wing radicalization that takes place because, you know, the web-based journal that I helped edit, I mean, this can go anywhere. Just through a Google search, people find it, whereas it used to be, if it didn't appear in the New York Times or something, people couldn't find it unless they live in a bigger city where there'd be these newspapers that or had a subscription to a left-wing newspaper. Okay, the second one, let me take the easier question first, which is it easier to be a Marxist today? Yeah, definitely it's easier, because ever since 1989 and 1991, I mean, a family member who's no revolutionary sent me a Christmas card, you know, sometime in the early 90s and said, "You're such a classic." And I had a picture of a classic car. Like, you know, it's like, well, hey, we're still talking about that stuff. That's a lot different from around 1986. I told a colleague, I said, not at Santa Barbara, different university, I said, yeah, I'm going away for the summer, and you won't see me till I said, where are you going? Russia? Yeah, to get your but if you were a Marxist in the US, it was like, well, maybe you were like an agent, you know, something like that. That was the implication. So it's a lot easier, but as I was saying, there's a lot of other radical ideas around, non-Marxist, and you know, some of them, I mean, Marx never wrote about transgender, so we have to create that. We don't just create it by ignoring what non-Marxists wrote about that. As to the theory of reproduction, I'm sorry, but I can't really say that much. It's something I haven't focused on myself a huge amount. I will say that some people that I worked with had critiques of it. Ryder Neoskaya critiques, Heather Brown has a critique, Lilia Monzo, who wrote a book on Marx and Race and Gender that's not been widely translated. One of the critiques is when you get into things like wages for housework, a lot of the more proletarian women, the most proletarian women, have to work outside of the home anyway. And so there's a problem of universalizing the woman as caregiver, and then critiquing that, whereas a lot of people aren't even able to do it. So there's other issues too, in terms of how value is created and so forth, because to say that labor doesn't create value is not a criticism or a diminution. Value creating labor is the most destructive and awful kind of labor in the world. So I don't see what's gained by trying to say that, as some do, that labor that Marx didn't think created value, we have to say it does create value. There's all kinds of, capitalism is it's like an octopus. No, that's not true. It sucks out. It's like a vampire, and that's an image that Marx actually uses. And so it sucks the life out of society, out of human beings and out of non-human nature. So to say, I don't know why we want to expand the notion of, because to have any kind of value production, you have to have all these prerequisites. As Marx says in almost the first sentence of the critique of the Gotha program, that they want to say that all value comes from labor, value comes from labor and interaction with nature. So there's that kind of background, and so those are just some very scattered thoughts. But I think some of my colleagues, like Heather Brown and Rydon Sky, have written a little bit about it, but not a lot. And I don't think we should make this a point of division today, because I don't think we should rush to take a position on what Marx himself would have said about this. I think we just have to. I think in the last few years, with the late Marx coming into the picture, which was frankly became known after most of the theories of reproduction were already developed, it all has to be looked at again in this light, and I welcome that debate. But I don't want to take a strong, clear position. Yeah, well, I just want to thank everybody. I think the discussion is something I'm going to take back with me, because this is an unfinished book, and I think particularly on the thing about, or for example, the thing about, is it related to, is or is it not related to capital, and those bonds, I think is important. What is its race doesn't figure as much in terms of black-white race relations in this book as it did in Marx at the Margins, because those Ireland writings are after the Civil War in the United States. He doesn't return to that topic a lot. There are some things in the ethnological notebook. There is a couple of lines about race in the Australian Aborigines. So I think I ought to find a way to, when I publish this book, to say that I still think race is very important. Because it's not like I stopped thinking that, and it's something I continue to publish on. What I want to do, this book is finished, and my next book, what I think I want to do is, Marx wrote articles for the New York Tribune for about 15 years, and in the collected works, and they're all in English, obviously, and the collected works, I think it's about 5 or 6 volumes, so like 4,000 pages of writing. And the myth is that these writings were just superficial to make money, but he has his crisis theory in there. He's got all kinds of things in there, and some of it's not very good, like some of what he says about India in 1853. So I think I'd like to write a book about that, which is, and there's writings on Turkey during the Crimean War, so, and a lot on Russia. So I think I'd like to write a book on that as my next book. But, you want to finish, I'm old enough that I think about, will I finish this book? But that's, a book I'd like to work on. And I think today I really appreciated how people wanted to make connections from the different parts of the work. Because when you write a book, it's like you do it chapter by chapter, and it gets separated. And of course, this is a way bigger audience than I've ever had in English on Marx at the Margins. I love to come to Brazil because there's only a couple places in the world where there's as active a discussion of Marxism, including among gender scholars, which it's fairly rare in the United States. It's starting to change a little bit, but it's fairly rare to have gender scholars who are Marxists or writing about Marx at all. The race scholars, we always had these people like W.E.B. Du Bois and others, C.L.R. James, that are part of the canon of black thought. So even someone like Cedric Robinson, who the book is called Racial Capitalism, and it's sort of Marxist, but it's really in a lot of ways anti-Marxist. But you can't dismiss Marx completely on race. It's never really been possible. But the writings of Marx on gender have been less prominent. And I think it's also, I mean, let's face it, I mean, there are political issues here too, which is that there are political movements that rooted themselves in Marxism and were absolutely terrible on gender. Some of the socialist currents around Marx's own time, but right up through, I mean, we have Me Too issues in almost all the large Marxist and left-wing movements. Whereas as early as the 1920s, at least in the United States, you could be kicked out of the Communist Party for racism. That was part of like the Constitution. So it's the, I mean, we can sit here and blame the neoliberal feminists and so on, but the opening was created for them by problems of in the left. And I'll just tell one anecdote about my mentor, because she worked with C.L.R. James, and C.L.R. James was way more prominent and still is. So one day, when I had just started working with her, I met this guy. I'm not going to mention his name, but he was an old Marxist, and he worked with C.L.R. James. And he said, well, you know, Ryan and C.L.R. James split in the 50s, and he said it was too bad. You know, she should have, I guess she should have stayed under his leadership. But, and he said, and anyway, she was crazy. She just, you know, was not right. And this is just the typical thing that is always said about women. And with Rosa Luxemburg, I don't know if it's known in Brazil, but Kautsky and Babel, who wrote a book on women and socialism, they have letters saying the poisonous bitch, Rosa Luxemburg, and like all these women, you know, once she starts getting a difference, she becomes intransigent and emotional, and you can't reason with them. These guys, so this is a long-standing problem that I think we have to address more. And I think, you know, and race obviously too, but I think there's much more acknowledgement of the importance of race. So anyway, I don't know where that takes us, but I'll end it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It was a fantastic talk and a very good evening here with you. And, pessoal, muito obrigado pela presença nessa primeira sessão. Nós vamos voltar às 6h30 para a abertura oficial do evento e logo a seguir a sessão plenária número 1, cujo título é Democracia, Capitalismo e Marx, e a gente vai contar aqui com a presença do Marcelo Augusto e da professora Virgínia Fontes. O Kevin trouxe no início, eu passei aqui, mas alguns chegaram depois, uns panfletos explicando o que é a organização que ele faz parte, em português, Organização Internacional Marxista Humanista. Se alguém quiser, e também passamos, depois, se puderem me devolver, uma lista de quem tem interesse em receber as newsletters por e-mail, né, da organização do Kevin. Muito obrigado, voltamos daqui a pouco às 6h30.